Hello and welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. From one fiasco to another, Washington has failed to change the regime in Syria, failed to effectively fight ISIL, and now wants Russia to fail. At the same time, Obama appears to be willing to arm any anti-regime fighter who can carry a gun. What could possibly go wrong with that? To Crosstalk Russia's counterterrorism efforts in Syria, I'm joined by my guest, Marcus Papadopoulos in London. He is the editor of Politics First magazine. Also in London, we have Roshan Mohammed Salih. He is a journalist and documentary filmmaker with Press TV. And in Los Angeles, we cross to Philippe Assouline. He is an international relations expert. All right, gentlemen, Crosstalk rules. In effect, that means you can jump in anytime you want, and I very much encourage it. Philippe, if I could go to you in Los Angeles, you got up very early to come to this program, and it's much appreciated. I suppose now I understand the term fog of war, because all of a sudden, the administration is talking about moderates and moderates and moderates and tens and hundreds of millions of dollars to train them in Syria. I thought we saw that film and it was a bad one. Now we're moving on to part two. What's your take?
Well, first of all, when you said fog of war, I thought you were referring to my early wake-up. Unfortunately, I have to agree with much of the introduction. The Americans do not seem to have a well-thought-out strategy. We've seen it in Libya. Right now, there doesn't seem to be any serious engagement, any long-term planning. However, my question, given that the Americans don't have any serious presence, given that they've been arming groups that will likely turn on them, like al-Nusra, what is the Russian endgame? Russia seems to want to return to the status before the Arab Spring. That means reinstating Assad's full control over the whole country. That is not going to be accepted lightly by the Sunnis. That's number one. And number two, in the region, the empowerment of the Shiite side through Russian assistance is going to cause instability in other countries. Yep. So my concern is, are the Russians there just to solidify their interest in the short term, or do they have a plan longer term?
I think that's a very, very good question. If I can say a few words, and then I'll go to Marcus here. Number one, I think in dealing with Assad, the Russians have been able to bring him to the table twice in Geneva over the last few years, and there was no one there to sit down. So it's very clear that the Russian side has talked about a political transition in Syria to wind down the civil war. So on that point there. Number two, of course there are risks involved in this here. And I think that from what Russia's perspective is to preserve the sovereignty of Syria and then go from there. And then we'll see what actors, legitimate actors, are there to talk to. Marcus, do you agree or disagree with me? And maybe you want to react to Philippe's questions. Go ahead.
I agree with what you said, Peter. You know, Russia is acting in Syria to, number one, defend its national security, because ISIS and Islamism in general poses a significant threat to the Russian Federation. And secondly, Russia is acting in Syria to defend the legitimate government of the country. And I think it's a very, very misleading way for commentators around the world to keep on referring to the Syrian regime, to Assad soldiers. No, the Syrian government, the Syrian army, President Assad, these are the legitimate people in Syria in accordance with international law. So Russia is acting because of out of national security interests, and also to ensure that the legitimate government in a country in a very strategic area, a very geostrategic area, does not collapse. Because if Syria collapses, if the Syrian government state collapses, then the current threat from ISIS will be increased tenfold. And I don't say this in a melodramatic way, but quite frankly, the world should thank God for the Syrian army, because the Syrian army is the heart and soul in the fight against ISIS and other Islamist groups. And also, the world should thank God for the Russian military strikes, because the Russian military strikes against ISIS and other Islamist groups in Syria are enabling the Syrian army to advance slowly in liberating areas of Syria which have been under the control of ISIS and other Islamist groups.
And Roshan, I noticed that you wanted to jump in there, and I'd like to also point out here, not to be a cheerleader or anything like that, but I mean, after 10 days or so of bombing, significant inroads in eroding the infrastructure of ISIL. I mean, the U.S., I mean, I've heard numbers from 20,000 to 60,000 sorties over the last year, violating Syria's airspace illegally every single time, hasn't had much success here. So do you want to kind of take one thread that you've heard already on this program? Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot to react to, but I mean, one of your guests said, does Russia want to go back to the pre-Arab Spring status quo? I mean, I've always opposed dictatorship throughout my life and my political career, my journalistic career, but I would go back to the pre-Arab Spring status quo in a heartbeat, because all we've got now is war, sectarianism, everyone at each other's throats, and I would prefer unsatisfactory dictatorship over that any day. What we need is a political solution. I'm not an advocate of foreign intervention in any country, but realistically, if people are going to call for Russia to pull out, they also have to call for Saudi Arabia to pull out. They also have to call for America to pull out, for Turkey to pull out. Either one pulls out, or either all of them pull out, or no one pulls out. Now, if the Russian intervention leads to the negotiating table, and that is the stated Russian aim, that everyone can negotiate a way out of this horrible conflict, then it would have been proved to be a success. If it leads to a greater escalation, then it would have been proved to be a failure. Now, the jury's out on that, but what it does seem like at the moment is in 1 or 2 weeks, Russia seems to really be taking on ISIS. It seems to be really taking on the so-called moderate rebels, other groups like Jabhat al-Nusra, and the Americans and the British have been doing that for 1 year without much success whatsoever.
Yeah, Philippe, I mean, a cynic would say, considering what's coming out of but specifically what's coming out of the Defense Department, Ashton Carter. I mean, my nickname for him now is loose rhetoric, because it's better for him to keep his mouth shut, because the more he runs his mouth, the more he makes it sound like the United States is going to align itself with Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda-like elements in Syria, protecting, quote unquote, their moderates. How do you react to that?
I'd like to take issue with something that was said before getting directly to your question. Calling Assad the legitimate government of Syria is a very big problem that is going to present a problem for the Russians long term. Barrel bombing your population, starving refugee camps, and killing or displacing millions of people does not make a dictator legitimate. And to come to a political solution, you have to have a realistic expectation. The Sunnis are not going to accept a Shiite puppet, Iran's puppet in place, because of everything going on in the Middle East. Now, the American method of, it seems, arming Al-Qaeda-affiliated groups and local nationalists so that they can bleed the Russians, that was quite a slip there, so that they can maybe test Russian new weapons, new tactics, is something that's going to turn around and backfire on the Americans and the region. I agree with you there. But to suppose that Russia can bomb its way back to some peaceful, even pre-Arab Spring state is very questionable. I don't see any horizon where the Sunnis of the Middle East, including the ones in Syria, are going to accept Assad staying or any Shiite puppet.
Okay, I have two gentlemen in London disagreeing with you, at least by their gestures. Marcus, go first, okay, real quick, and then we'll go to... let me go to Marcus first. Go ahead.
I completely disagree with that. Most Syrians support the Syrian government and President Assad, either actively or passively. And I think it's very, very misleading and dangerous for people to subscribe to this notion that President Assad, his government and the Syrian army, they are anti-Sunni. That is absolute nonsense. Look, President Assad's wife is a Sunni. Most of the Syrian high command are Sunnis. If most Sunnis in Syria loathed the Syrian government, loathed the Syrian armed forces, then the Syrian state would have collapsed years ago. I think that's a very misleading and a dangerous way to approach this. The reality is that President Assad is the legitimate leader of Syria. I loathe the Saudi establishment. I loathe the Saudi royal family. But I would never seek for a war to be put out against them. I would never seek for them to be undermined, because they are the legitimate leaders of Saudi Arabia, in accordance with the UN Charter and international law. President Assad is the legitimate leader of Syria, it or not.
And he is, and we're not going to get around that, okay? Let me go to Russia and London. Please do jump in.
I don't think he is.
Well, he is, and that's the only partner we have there.
When people...
Go ahead. Jump in.
What makes him legitimate?
No. Come on, let's equal time, everybody. We can disagree all we want, but equal time. Roshan, go ahead. In London.
Yeah, I just don't like it when people see the whole Middle East through this simplistic Sunni-Shia lens. Everyone tends to do it, and I really think it's just oversimplistic and quite comical at times. The Syrian Arab Army is majority Sunni. That is a fact. And so if the Syrian Arab Army is majority Sunni, then it isn't Shias killing Sunnis or Alawites killing Sunnis. It's Sunnis killing Sunnis. So it's an absolutely ridiculous proposition. The fact is that Syria is divided. No one speaks for the Syrian people in their majority, but I think that it's pretty obvious now that President Assad is the most popular single leader in Syria, and even the people that don't like him prefer him over ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra. And at the moment, this comes down to a straight battle between Assad. Who do you prefer, Assad or Jabhat al-Nusra, which is Al-Qaeda in Syria, or ISIS? Because if Assad falls, that's what's going to happen. It's going to be a terrorist state, and the moderate rebels aren't going to take over. Liberal human rights activists in the West should wake up and smell the coffee. It's going to be terrorist groups like Jabhat al-Nusra and ISIS.
Okay,
and
gentlemen,
burn the whole country and burn the whole region.
Let me go to Philippe, give him the last word before we go to the break. Philippe, who is America's #1 enemy in this civil war? Real quickly, go ahead.
The answer is yes. I think both sides pose a problem, but to keep saying that Assad is legitimate and wanted by the majority, based on what? As the last commentator said, most people see this simply as a Sunni-Shiite divide. That means the people in the region do too. And there's nothing to point that Assad has the support of the majority, or this rebellion or revolution.
Does the Syrian army pose a threat to people in London? Does the Syrian army pose a threat to people in London or in New York? ISIS poses a threat to people in London and New York, but the Syrian army doesn't.
Hezbollah and Iran absolutely do.
And
we're talking about the Syrian army.
Hezbollah has been fighting ISIL longer than anyone else alongside the Syrian army. Gentlemen, we're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on Syria. Stay with our team. Okay, Marcus, I'm going to go back to you in London. I mean, and looking at the rhetoric coming out of Washington, I mean, they're furious, to say the least, about Russia's counterterrorism activities in Syria, which have been invited by the government in Damascus here. And from what I can see coming out of the Pentagon and other individuals in the State Department, they are aiming for a proxy war with Russia. Is this a wise move? Go ahead.
I think there's every possibility that that's what we could see unfold in the future. What we've seen in the last week or so is that the Syrian army, in tandem with the Russian military, is starting to make progress on the ground. It's starting to liberate areas from Islamist control. And in doing so, they are coming across American weaponry, which has been given to the Islamists. So that is an indication that these groups are still receiving American weapons. And of course, we've heard talk as well from various Islamist groups in Syria, in particular on the border with Turkey, which has facilitated the arrival in Syria of many Islamist terrorists, that these groups are receiving anti-tank weapons, anti-tank missiles from America and from their regional allies. So I think we could be in a similar situation to Afghanistan in the 1980s, when the Americans, led by the CIA and people like Charles Wilson, were arming the Mujahideen, including Osama bin Laden, in their fight against the Russians. I don't believe the Americans were actually behind the Islamist uprising in Syria. I think the Americans are opportunists. They've got an objective, and that objective is to overthrow the Syrian government. If you overthrow the Syrian government, you end Russian influence in the Middle East, you end Iranian influence, you get rid of Israel's arch enemy. And I don't believe they have a strategy, but I believe that's their objective.
Okay.
And even though they failed so far, they will pursue
okay,
it.
But
Can I jump in here?
Okay, but with just the caveat here, I think that Marcus is right. But you know, they've tried this scenario over and over again, and it always ends in absolute catastrophe. One country after another. Philippe in Los Angeles, jump in.
Yes, I have no disagreement with that, but the Russians are doing the exact same thing. When the last guest said the Americans are supporting Islamist terrorists, that's exactly what the Russians are doing by supporting Iran and Hezbollah. You can't beat a terrorist by using a terrorist and then expect peace to happen.
So
it's the same irresponsible use of
so
the
you
word
think?
legitimate.
Do you think? No,
This
let
is
me
not a
ask.
counter-attack.
No.
Please let me finish.
No,
Please,
you bring up.
please,
You
please.
bring up. This is the second time you brought up this point. Gentlemen. So what?
I think it's an important point.
Philippe,
It's an important point.
I think it's a very odd point because Philippe, if I could throw it back at you, so you are saying that Hezbollah in Iran should not fight ISIL, right? Is that what you're saying?
That's not what I'm saying.
Well, that's what it sounds
That's not
like.
what I'm saying. There are alternatives between the two. Well, let me explain myself. I think it's very clear this is a pattern in the Middle East generally, but Assad and Iran have been using ISIS to make Assad look good. They've actually bought oil from them and let them rise, and there's been a tacit agreement for years.
I think that's offensive to ordinary civilians in Syria who've been murdered by ISIS.
Okay, look, it's not a public relations contest in the Middle East.
I don't think Assad supporters should talk about civilian casualties. Assad supporters should not be preaching about civilian casualties.
I'm a supporter of the Syrian government.
Gentlemen, let's make it clear
That's
here.
the same
Let's
thing.
let's
the
be
same
clear,
thing.
gentlemen, and our viewers should know, according to UN estimates, half of the people that have died in this horrific conflict have been fighting for the survival of the sovereign state of Syria. And I'm talking about soldiers, I'm talking about people that work for the state. So let's, blood is really awful, and it's on a lot of people. Check United Nations. Look at a lot of other charting, following the death scale going on in Syria. Everybody just throws up this number. They never break it down. So there's a lot of tragedy for a lot of people. And I'd point out, if I would go, let's keep the equal time here. Roshan, if I go to you in London, I mean, this is akin to what Russians understand during the Great Patriotic War against fascism. Everyone in that country is touched by this war. Everybody loses someone. Go ahead.
Yeah. Look, I mean, we're not living the Star Wars movie here. It's not Darth Vader versus Luke Skywalker. Everyone's got some blood on their hands. But as you say, if you break down the figures, the number of dead on both sides, both civilian and military, it's pretty even. Now, I mean, your guest there seemed to be reading off an Israeli press release. I mean, everything's Iran's fault, isn't it? Everything's the Shia's fault, Hezbollah's fault. If it rains, Hiroshima, whatever, let's throw everything in there. It's all Iran's fault. But
How convenient.
I wanted to say something about US strategy where I might disagree with all of you, is that actually I think US strategy is actually working because their strategy is to bleed the country and get everyone fighting each other.
True.
I think at the beginning they did want Assad to be overthrown, to cut the link from Iran to Hezbollah, from Assad, that link, or to bleed everybody basically. But now I think they're also concerned about the extremist groups on the other side, what would happen. That could potentially threaten Israel as well, such instability on Israel's borders. And Israel ultimately is their focus here. That's their strategy to protect Israel. So, ultimately, I think that, the US...
That's why they empowered Iran with this nuclear deal?
Bombing everyone down, a massive attritional war, and therefore Russia should also beware of getting involved in a potential another Afghanistan. I don't think that's going to happen,
for the first time,
US strategy, it's working fine.
The first Russian bomb dropped on Syria, I told everyone, I said, there are risks involved. Obviously, there are. Marcus, we heard a very interesting point here. And I think this is what makes the Americans so angry, is that the Russians are hitting terrorist groups, all kinds of different terrorist groups, with people being supported by the Saudis, by the Turks, the Qataris, go on and on and on, okay? And what really angers the Americans is that the Russians are not destroying infrastructure, because that's what they've been doing with their sorties for the last year, is destroying the state known as Syria. Go ahead.
Yes, because as I said just now, the Americans have an objective. It's an objective in the White House, in the State Department, in the CIA, and it continues throughout whichever administration, Republican or Democratic. It is to overthrow the Syrian government, to destroy the Syrian state. And that is an objective that they will pursue. And the way they're denigrating the Russian attacks is not surprising. Within a few hours of the Russian campaign starting, we heard that civilians were being killed. Now we hear that moderate groups are being attacked. Well, this idea about moderate groups in Syria, it's a myth. If we go back to 2011, when the Islamist uprising, I emphasise Islamist uprising, began in Syria, the most potent terrorist force was the Free Syrian Army. Now, that's a very sexy name. That's a very Hollywood name. But let's just break it down. The Free Syrian Army was never a unified force. It was a mosaic. It was an eclectic group of different Islamist groups. And how did ISIS emerge in Syria? It emerged because there was a brotherly falling out between all these different Islamist groups, Al-Nusra, Islamic Front, Free Syrian Army, and a lot of them, they turned to ISIS and they took their weapons, their money, and the training that they had received from the West and regional allies, Saudi Arabia and Turkey, to ISIS. So there may be a handful of moderate fighters up and down Syria, but there has never been genuinely, truly speaking, moderate groups in Syria. If you ask the Kurds in the north of the country, who don't exactly have much love for the Syrian government, they will say they prefer the Syrian government over ISIS, over Islamic Front, and over other Islamist groups in the country.
Okay, Philip, how do you react to that? Because that's the new mantra again. You know, the moderate theme disappeared last year, and now it's suddenly reappeared. I mean, in your mind, are there real moderates that should be supported? Because the Obama administration is looking to dig deeper into its pockets and support groups in Syria at the tune of $600 million. That's not pocket change.
No, I don't think there are any real, any substantially important or capable moderate groups. But nor is our side moderate, nor is that side moderate. And please let me finish my point this time. We hear about now the U.S. is doing this for Israel. The U.S. all these ridiculous points that some of the commentators have made. The U.S. just empowered Iran to the tune of $150 billion, possibly, put Iran on steroids. It's seen as being on the side of the Shiites. Its opposition to Assad was mostly verbal, despite red lines. And you remember how Putin got involved with the chemical weapons issue because it didn't want to upset the Iranian conversation. Now they're arming groups that are terrorist groups, just like Hezbollah is a terrorist group. It is going to backfire. I am not defending that policy. But I do think between presenting Russia as this savior against terrorism, when in fact it's going to be aiding Hezbollah, and that everybody's a terrorist on the Sunni side, there should be some kind of a middle ground. And I want to know what Russia is thinking.
It's very important, Philippe, to point out that I don't consider Hezbollah a terrorist group. You do. A small number of Western countries in the world consider Hezbollah
a terrorist group.
Okay, the thing is that you know, for most people in the region look at Hezbollah as a national resistance movement that defended itself and the country called Lebanon against Israeli aggression, backed by the United States. Okay, so I mean, this is not CNN or BBC where you can just banter about these terms. They don't have the same meaning here. Clearly, they don't. No, because this is
I'm not the one who's been using the term terrorist. I'm sorry, with respect. I'm not the one been throwing around the term terrorist.
I think people the proxies in Syria, they're called terrorists. They're supported by the outside. A lot of them aren't even Syrian. Okay, they're bussed in, flown in, tunneled in from Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries all over the region. Okay, they're called terrorists.
I told you I
That's
agree.
What they are.
I'm okay with that.
Okay.
So is Hezbollah. It's the definition of terrorist, a group that is non-state that attacks civilians.
We're talking about saving the state of Syria.
And it's Islamist.
Okay, Marcus, you want to jump in real quick?
Correct. You don't do that by empowering Iran.
Can I say the gentleman's obsession with Hezbollah is not helpful. Look, you know, the West led by America, the West led by America gave birth to Al Qaeda. Israel's actions in the Lebanon gave birth to Hezbollah. You know, it's human nature, action, reaction. With the way Israel acts in the region, you are going to get a response to that. I thought it was Russia's actions in Afghanistan
that gave birth to Al Qaeda. Actually,
I'm going to jump in here, Russia.
Well, I think you'll find the
Russia's going to get a response.
I want to give our second guest in London
Russia's going to get a response. That's what I'm saying.
Fair time. Go ahead. Russian, go ahead.
Yeah, just really 3 quick points. I mean, you know, despite what our guest says, there is a strategic alliance between the US and Israel for years. They fund them to billions. They arm them to the tune of billions. We all know that. It's established fact. There is no strategic alliance between Iran and the US.
Like Syria and Assad.
Conspiracy theory. Iran forced the US to the table. The US tried everything to bomb Iran, to destroy it economically. It failed, and it was forced to make a deal. My final point is that ultimately no side can win this war. You know, the Iranians, the Russians, the Americans, the Saudis, no side can win this war. a political solution needs to be imposed before the whole region burns.
Okay, on that point, gentlemen, we've run out of time. Many thanks to my guests in London and in Los Angeles. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RT.
Thank you.
See you next time. And remember, crosstalk rules.